Thank you, Ria and Angie. Everybody at home, thank you for watching. Welcome, Virtual ComFest 2021. I am here right now with Mary Jane Borden and also Victoria Cohn, and they're going to be talking. They're going to be doing a wellness class for us here, and it's the road to where we are now. And without further ado, I will let you two take it over.
Well, thank you so much. It's a delight to be here for Virtual ComFest. Uh, it's kind of sad not to be at the real person-to-person ComFest that we've been so used to for so many years. But I was telling the other folks here, the one thing I'm really missing is the mud. We used to call this Mud Fest. You right? Right? Okay, and I'm really delighted to be here to talk about at least my favorite topic, maybe yours too, which is cannabis, aka marijuana. And the title of my presentation is called The Road to Where We Are Now. And I'll be honest with you guys, okay, be ready here. This is going to be facts. You know, this is going to be a series of facts and things that you really need to know, I think, to be effective advocates for cannabis and also to advance cannabis to where we need it to be. And that's where we are. In order to understand how we got to where we are now, we think we need to understand the road to that got us here. Now, what you'll see is this is kind of tied to one of my old favorite Grateful Dead songs, which I think is called "The Ripple." Believe it or not, just like ComFest, just like some other things we're going to talk about, this is the 50th. Believe it or not, this is the 50th anniversary of that song. And there was a clause in the song that really touched me. That I structured this presentation around it, and it says, "There is a road, no simple highway, between the dawn and the dark of night." And I think that really describes our journey with cannabis. So what I want to do is begin the presentation and go to our first slide. And this is going to be the goals of what we're going to try to do today. And cannabis, I think we all know that, but we have to kind of tell the world that cannabis is different from pharmaceuticals. It's new market, it's new, and there seems to be a rush to invent this new market, if you will, but it has a legacy, and it's traveled with us over a long time. So today I want you to watch this presentation, if you will, please, this recitation of cannabis facts. I want you to gain an appreciation for cannabis through its historic backdrop. I'm hoping everybody comes to understand that through that backdrop, we come to understand why we're at where we are at now. And we're going to recognize that there's a new era beginning. And this is kind of comes down to some of the ComFest values. This helps us determine what this next era of cannabis is going to look like. So let's take it down. Now I want to go back to the step here. This is a trip. This is a road trip, if you want to call it that. So you'll see this program structured in terms of a number of different stops in the kind of the metaphoric trip. You know, you're going to take a vacation trip. This is what you're going to do. Okay, so I'm going to start here with the trip prep, which is the basics. Now, I know this is an experienced crew, maybe. So I'm going to probably tell you things you already know. I apologize for that, but there are so many people out there who are new to this, who need to understand this information. So let's start with our trip through the road to where we are now with the very basics. Okay, cannabis is a part of the genus Cannabis sativa L plant. The female plant is what we both pay attention to, which has the cannabinoids, the terpenoids, the flavonoids, and phytosteroids in the secreting flowers. You know, the cannabis has flowers. And the ones that we're most familiar with, what we call cannabinoids, include tetrahydrocannabinol, which is THC, cannabidiol, which is our CBD, cannabinol, CBN, and there's a host of other ones. And they have to be heated. At least the THC and CBD have to be somehow heated in order to become active. And that happens when you smoke it, or you vape it, or you cook it in oils. Now I want to just point out right now that hemp is defined as 0.3% THC. We'll get to understand a little bit why that's important later on. But hemp is a little bit different than marijuana, but they're all the same plant, right? Okay. So cannabis medicines fall into three categories, basically. There's single pharmaceutical companies like those single molecular compounds. There's extracts that are pharmaceuticals like Sativex and Epidiolex. And there's the botanicals, those that we all know and love. Now, I wanted the most important point on this particular discussion is that no one in history has ever died from an overdose of cannabis. Let that sink in. It's virtually impossible. All right. So next part of our trip prep is what's called the endocannabinoid system. Say that 3 times fast. Endocannabinoid system. Now, this is an endogenous. Endogenous means inside of our bodies. This is an internal structure that we have. You know, you've got your circulatory system, you've got your respiratory system. You also have an endocannabinoid system that is running on cannabinoids, which are similar to what is in the cannabis plant. Surprise! Cannabis is medicinal, right? So marijuana is like it's natural occurring. All right, again, it has this THC, CBD, and they activate the same parts of our brains called receptors that we have internal cannabinoids, internal chemicals in our bodies that do the same thing. And I want to point out here, the endocannabinoid system is present in all mammals. That means, think about it. There's this old saying called "Blessed be the ties that binds." These are the ties that bind us all together. All right, we all have endocannabinoid systems. All right, now we're going to go back to ancient history. This is where we're starting our trip. This is stop 1. And our trip first comes, we have to go back in time. 20,000 years ago. 20,000, conceptualize that. Cannabis was with us 20,000 years ago. And it was included in scrolls of medicinal plants for the Egyptians. It was found in the tomb of Ramses. The Spanish brought it to the Americas in the mid-1500s. And yes, it was introduced as a crop to Jamestown in 1611. All right, cannabis has undergone what I call several different renaissances. We could say we're in a renaissance now, but we go back 100, 150 years. There was a time when it really wasn't on the radar, wasn't on the map. But again, these renaissance happened, and it happened in the 1850s. So cannabis all of a sudden emerged once a doctor went to India and began to research this and said, wait a second, this stuff has medicinal value. This is Dr. William O'Shaughnessy. And he wrote papers, and I think one of the most interesting papers that was written back in the 1850s, that was one that was the report to the Ohio State Medical Committee on Cannabis Indica, that was written in 1860 at the annual meeting of the Ohio State Medical Society, and the report that they put out extolled the benefits of cannabis in insomnia, convulsions, seizures, and a host of other conditions. So think about 1860 here in Ohio State. This is the Ohio State Medical Committee. We're talking about the medical benefits of cannabis. All right, so then, of course, came along cannabis prohibition. Now, this is a part of the progressive movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where they thought, at a time when they thought, well, if we regulate our vices, then they won't be vices anymore. We saw that with alcohol prohibition. The same thing was happening with cannabis, and that happened in 1925 with a treaty with the League of Nations. So then after that, there was just more and more things that were limiting the availability of cannabis. And a lot of these were driven by a guy named Harry Anslinger. And for example, the Marijuana Tax Act, the Single Convention Treaty, those things, even the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, were all driven by Harry Anslinger's. I guess he hated marijuana. Who knows why? And we could go into racism. I've worked with the racism sides of cannabis and produced some tables on that. And it was deeply integrated in with prohibition from the early 1900s onward. The laws that were implemented back then, you would be shocked at the racist intonations in them. So that's part of why we're at where we're at today, is because the racism that was placed into cannabis prohibition beginning in the 1930s. But like I say, cannabis comes and it goes. And now in the late 1980s and 90s, cannabis was experiencing a renaissance. There was a investigational drug program that was started in the late 1980s, and it allowed AIDS patients to have access to cannabis. AIDS was a major pandemic back then. So some people were able to be a part of that program and get cannabis for free from the federal government, which they still do today. All right, but this, I think, is one of the most important things I've heard from a federal judge. It goes all the way back to 1988. DEA Administrative Law Judge Francis Young, in a rescheduling hearing, stated, and I quote him directly on this: "Marijuana, in its natural form, is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man." That was 1988. This is 2021. Think about it. All right, so we're going to play Todd here a little bit. I want to point out that the first dispensary was opened in 1996 after the passage of Proposition 215 in 1996. Dr. Raphael Mechoulam and his colleagues discovered the endocannabinoid system and the receptors that run it back in the 1990s. And so, this was going on. There was a lot of obstacles that had to be overcome just to get this far. And I want to talk a little bit about what those obstacles are, because they are really, anything you see on this page is still, even today, is still active, still an obstacle. So first of all, you have the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution, which establishes that the feds, well, they're the law of the land, and what they say goes, right? All right. Okay. And that makes cannabis federally legal throughout the United States. Anywhere, I want to point this out to you guys, anywhere you have federal land, you're on federal property, you're under the umbrella of the federal government and federal law. All right? So we'll get to that in a minute, but that's a very important point there. And the other important point I think I want to point out is about the research. A lot of people will tell you, we can't legalize marijuana because there just isn't any research. Well, folks, there can't be any research. It's not possible because the DEA has scheduled cannabis as a Schedule I substance that has no medical benefits. There's nobody using it medically. So according to the DEA, according to the federal government, it has to be amongst the most harmful substances there are known to man. We know it doesn't belong there, but that's where it is, all right? And so under that light, we're competing then with the federal government and the FDA development, after the clinical trial process. And the FDA doesn't like botanicals. And to get one drug approved, it's $2.6 billion. It takes 12 years. And then you have to have a 20-year exclusive patent. There's just a disconnect completely from what cannabis is and how we use it. So I want to point out, too, the war on drugs, because this is the 50th anniversary of the war on drugs. In other words, in 1971, Richard Nixon, if you read the sidebar there, read what he says. It was created, the war on drugs was created to harm people of color and so-called hippies, which were people who were my age back then, young people who had kind of a liberal bent to them. All right? That's the sole purpose of the war on drugs that exists 50 years later. We're sitting here today. It's still in force. And this is from the Center of American Progress. I think you guys can read this later on or read it on my other, but you can see how awful the war on drugs is. It cost $1 trillion over the course of its lifetime. Can you imagine what we could do with $1 trillion? And the carcerated population, the number of arrests, it persists. Now is the time to end the war on drugs. It's one of the worst public policies that has been ever envisioned. It's probably America's longest running war. But we are changing course, and there are ways of changing course. For example, the anti-commandeering doctrine prevents the federal government from using its force against state and local governments, which means the feds can't come in and bust somebody just because they have marijuana if it's legal under state law. Okay? And that's how the legal status of marijuana, the dispensaries, the growers, the whole program in Ohio and other states rests solely on an amendment to a federal appropriations bill that prohibits the U.S. Justice Department from spending money to interfere with state marijuana laws. That's that thread. That's a thread that keeps these businesses. This is to say, something to be like a 17 to 20 billion dollar industry in the United States. That's the thread that holds it together. So now, how do we change law? Well, we could do it through the Congress. We could do it through legislators, Congress or legislatures. We could do it through ballot issues, and we could do it through local councils and boards. Now, I want to first, before we get too deeply into that, let's find out where we're at with marijuana laws in Ohio. And if we have enough time, I don't know if that we will, but if we have enough time, I'd like to go in a little further depth on this after the end of the presentation. But if we don't, I think that, let's just focus on this for a moment here, because this is where the law is at now. There was a time before, Colorado and Washington legalized in 2012, when Ohio was one of the most liberal states concerning marijuana in the nation. We had, if you were caught with 3 ounces, basically, or less, it was $150 fine with no criminal record. And in the 1975, I could tell you a real story, but I won't tell you right now, about 1975, that I remember when that law passed. And that was groundbreaking. It saved some of my friends from serious prison time, okay? So, but now, this law seems antiquated. Okay, if just for example, it's only $150 fine, but that's a lot for some people. Okay, but you start getting into the oils, you start getting into more quantity, and you could still be incarcerated, and you could still pay heavy fines. If you're a grower, you're going to pay. You could have, for example, it says 1,000 grams. 18 months or 8 years incarceration, $250,000 to $2,500 to $20,000 fine. That's a dispensary, isn't it? Think about it. All right. So I want to point out one other point here on this slide, and that's home rule, which is really important. That's how we change law at the local level. And I'll go into that a little bit later here, but I think it's important to understand that's why we get the disparity in Ohio, even between, let's say, Columbus, the state of Ohio, and federal land, all right? So it's because they've gone in and said Columbus can make its own rules, and we're going to decriminalize cannabis at a much lighter sentences than what we see here. So let's go to the marijuana control program. Now here we have a legal program, and I'll bet you there's millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars flowing through the dispensaries just in Columbus here, between Verdant, that's up off of Cassidy Road, Terrasana, that's over in Grandview, Botanist, that's in downtown Columbus, Blue Medicinal, that's down off Georgesville Road. Think about the millions and millions and millions of dollars that are flowing through these. And they're serving patients. I think that probably the best thing is that, when we were looking, and I've done this work, we were looking at what's going on out there. And the first number one thing we had to do before legalizing for everybody else was to take the patients off the battlefield of the drug war. And we did that. I am so proud of that. And so Governor Kasich signed that bill into law in June of 2016. And they have to have a qualifying condition to participate. You have to have a doctor's recommendation. I will point out that it's a very robust program, I think, in many, many ways for the breadth and quality of the things that you can buy. It kind of blows my mind. Wait, this is actually legal now? Really? But smoking is prohibited, even though they sell flower. Flower is expected to be vaped, not smoked, okay? So, and I want to say, Americans for Safe Access seems to agree kind of with my perception that it may not be a perfect program, but if it was in school, it'd get a B grade, and I think that's pretty good, all right? So this is, because we've seen, on our trip so far, we've seen kind of where we've been, and here's where we are. We are still in a situation where prohibition reigns in the United States. And it's all, I think, nowadays, we've changed course in the states, we've changed course in local communities, but where we have not changed course is in the federal government, and I'm we'll talk about a little later if we get time about the federal law in this. And so because of all these inequities, it's still very, very important to address the federal issue. And so there is, I did an analysis recently of the pending legislation, and here's what we're looking at. We're looking at, in the federal government, in the U.S. Congress and House, there have been 36 House and Senate bills introduced so far in 2021. That may sound like a lot, but there have been more in a few years before. During the late 2009 and 2010, there really was hardly anything going on federally. The important thing we want to talk about with respect to legislation is the MORE Act. It's the biggest deal. It's called the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. And this is the most important part of it, I think, is that it removes cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act. It takes it out from underneath that Schedule I, the oversight by the DEA, and all those things that have contributed to so much injustice surrounding, where we're at today. And so I think that anyone who is in favor of cannabis needs to contact their senator or their congressman and say, you got to get this thing through Congress, which it was passed by Congress last year, and then get it past the Senate, which may or may not happen, I don't know. But there are other important bills that we could talk about banking, we could talk about insurance, all these things that businesses and individuals are denied because cannabis is illegal. You can't have a bank account, you can't have insurance, et cetera, et cetera. Try to operate a business without insurance. Are you kidding me? What happens if a tree falls on it? You're liable. There are two viable bills in Ohio. First, HB 60, which is for autism disorder, adds autism disorder to the list of qualifying conditions. That may well pass. I think it's got some about 15 co-sponsors. HB 210, which would allow cultivation, possession of marijuana, and like I said, all cultivation I think is most important here because many, many people really feel strongly, and I do too, about the ability to grow a simple plant. Think about this, a simple plant, just a couple of them, please, in my home or in my, backyard. I can't, for the life of me, understand why that has to be this big felony thing. But that's what HB 210 would do. But unfortunately, it has no co-sponsors and it doesn't have any hearing scheduled, so it's kind of sitting out there in dormant land, okay? I want to recognize the individuals, well, I'll just say Northern Appalachia and the Sensible Coalition Movement, who I think do absolutely awesome work here. So here's a shout out to these guys because they have decriminalized cannabis possession in, let's get this, 22 Ohio cities. In fact, they were involved in decrim in Ohio in 2018. Columbus in 2018. So they have been hard at work on this since about 2014. And they've got, I think, 5 or 6 more cities that are ready to come online. In other words, they'll have those initiatives on the ballot this fall. And so if you guys are interested in really getting involved in the marijuana reform, it's at this local level. So you want to give these guys a call and collect some signatures for them, okay? Because you're not going to be collecting them for a statewide ballot issue this year. It's just not going to happen. COVID did a number on ComFest. Well, COVID did a number on signature gathering. And there's also a much higher count than they used. I think you have to get over 400,000 signatures. It's gone out of our range to be able to gain signatures and put initiatives on the ballot, at least on a statewide basis, so as it stands right now. So I wouldn't look forward to that happening anytime soon. But I want to recognize some milestones here, and I think that here we have, as I was saying earlier, the federal government prevents a lot from happening. They think they can, because there's the federal supremacy. Well, 36 states now have medical marijuana laws. We just added Alabama. Alabama, is there a deeper South state than Alabama? If we could do it there, we could do it anywhere. All right, 17 states now have legalized adult use. I had put Connecticut in there because I wasn't sure where they were at, where I believe their governor's going to sign that bill like now. So we can add that to the list of the full legal, if you want to call it that. I like to call them adult use states. So this is moving in the right direction, and I think if this is the road we're heading towards, we should be heading on a good path towards adult use legislation for everyone. And now we're down to only 3 states that don't have some kind of a medical marijuana law. That's Idaho, Kansas, and forgive me if I get the third one. You know what the third one, Victoria?
No, off the top of my head.
Okay, well, there's another one. I'll think of it in a minute. People basically are still using cannabis about the same rate that they are now. No, South Dakota was under passed as a ballot issue. So anyway, yeah. So anyway, there's the medical marijuana control program has 207,000 patients. 207,000 people have signed up for medical marijuana in Ohio. Let that one blow your mind, okay? And so, but unfortunately, even so, 17,000 people were arrested in 2016, I think it was, for possession. Are we kidding me? Blows my mind. Okay, so look, crystal ball into the future. What does the future look like? All right, I think the future looks bright. And I'm just jaded. I have this rosy personality. Everything's right with the world. But one thing that really struck me when I did this particular slide was that cannabis, and marijuana, in terms of their counts in PubMed.gov, which is basically lists research studies, they had grown by 10,000. Each of those categories, 10,000 since I checked in 2017. Think about it, 10,000. That's how many more research studies there are. For like drugs that are common out there, like Celex or Humira, you always see that on TV. Yeah, they had a handful more. I mean, cannabis research is exploding, and if we could take the handcuffs off that have been put there by the federal government, it's going to lead to great places. And it's showing that people are using this cannabis as a substitute for prescription drugs, and particularly if they suffer from pain, anxiety, and depression. And when they said the use of pharmaceutical drugs for which marijuana could serve as an alternative fell significantly once the law was implemented. So I imagine the pharmaceutical industry's out there going, they're biting their fingernails, go, what are we going to do? Because we're going to lose all this precious market share. Okay, for just a couple more things here. Treating cancer, this is important because did you know back in 1974, at one of the university studies found that cannabinoids, THC, cured cancer. I mean, it kills cancer cells. It induces apoptosis. I think I pronounced that right. Apoptosis. Thank you, Vic. Got me there. It induces that apoptosis. And so we need that as a therapy. But you know why we don't have it? 50 years of prohibition under the Controlled Substances Act. That's why we still have people dying and suffering from cancer, and moreover, suffering from cancer chemotherapy drugs. Opioid addiction. We're at record numbers of overdoses, yet the state of Ohio will not approve opioid use as a reason for cannabis use for opioid addiction. You know, they say, well, there's not enough research. Well, let me go back a full circle here and tell you why. All right, you can see some quotes there. So full circle, I want to stop. This is the final stop on the tour here. And I ask, what would be the implications for mankind if every single one of us had a functioning endocannabinoid system? And Dr. Ethan Rousseau released an landmark paper that said basically some of us who might use cannabis more than others might be suffering from an endocannabinoid deficiency. In other words, our systems, our digestive system, our circulatory system, don't have enough of the things that make them run. So not enough cannabinoids to make our bodies run properly, and that's why some people might tend to gravitate towards it more than others. And also, because of cannabis interacts with the other compounds that are in the plant itself, there's CBN, CBD, THC, and all the others, the terpenoids, all work together, all work in unity and solidarity to create what's called an entourage effect. In other words, the sum is greater than the individual parts. And that's really important to therapy, okay? And I say right there, because of the endocannabinoid system, again, I come back and say, blessed be the tides that bind. All right, so this is kind of the destination. We want to make sure that you have knowledge about cannabis, that you understand the things that are, and the arguments that are, get our message off to lawmakers and to the public, so that we can get cannabis out of the clutches of the federal government and prohibition. And if this were any other presentation, I'd say, do you have any questions?
Anthony has questions for you, actually.
I would love it. I would love it.
Well-
So I'm just going to advance it here. This particular slide here, if you advance one here, Vic, I don't know what you got looking there. This is some testimonials. Vic and I have been doing this for about 10 years now. These are words of actual people who've written us and said, this is what cannabis does for me.
Wonderful.
It's amazing.
That's wonderful. And some of the stuff that you were talking about, just with some of the legal stuff where you're talking about getting patients off of the battlefield, I think that's pretty powerful. And there's a lot of stuff I didn't even know how harsh some of the penalties still were for something that even our state is calling and considering medicine. So it's pretty eye-opening stuff, what you've been sharing with us today, and we really appreciate you coming out here to do all that. Thank you, Mary Jane. Thank you, Victoria. We're super happy to have you do this. Before I send it off to a couple pre-recorded videos that we have for you, I do want to say one more time, please make sure to go out to donate.comfest.com. We don't survive without you guys, and even though we don't have you in person this year, we're happy to have you watching us virtually. If you're enjoying what you're seeing, please go out to that site, and don't forget, you're already on the ComFest site. Check out the merch. I'm going to be here in a little bit going through some of the cool stuff that we have on the site, and some of the cool stuff from street fairs and past. So thank you so much, and we will go ahead and now send it off to How to ComFest, and that'll be